Today we're going to look at the character of Holden and also looking at Holden as a narrator. And in addition to that, I also want us to consider Holden's character and its relation to the key themes of the novel. So to start off with, Holden is a teenager in conflict. I think we'd all agree with that. He doesn't know how to deal with the pressure of expectation, and he feels quite burdened by those expectations. And so he ends up in various unusual situations in an attempt to find himself, to express himself, and to express his, at times dynamic, at times articulate, at times quite immature ideas. He's isolated, he's alone, and he's confused. And every attempt at understanding the adult world in which he's expected to live seems to only depress him further. So ultimately, Holden's sensitivity is at the heart of the novel. It animates a story, it makes it compelling. And in many respects, I think too, it's the reason why teenagers over many generations have related to Holden as a character. The thing with Holden is that whenever he speaks of his experiences, he can't speak in a neutral way. He speaks with judgment, and that judgment is largely negative, it's cynical. So through his narration, we see a young man who's so displeased with himself and with much of the world around him that his strongest impulse is to leave, it's to break loose, to move on. And from his pain follows rejection and further retreat. Speaking of Holden's judgmental attitude, we see that best illustrated in his vernacular lexicon. He uses this vernacular lexicon to render this judgment. Some people are bastards, others jerks. The way they act, he says, makes you want to puke. Holden's favorite adjectives are words like depressing, corny, dopey, crummy, screwed up, boring, and of course, phony. Phony is Holden's most frequent term of abuse, and ultimately it's the strongest and most ethically weighted. It is his ultimate way of describing the adult world. Besides his characteristic judgmental approach, the other facet of Holden's personality worth considering is his attitude towards sex. He's upset by the realization that sex can be casual, despite his belief that it should be shared by people who care deeply about each other. So, in a sense, Holden's guilty of romanticizing the notion of sex and trying to keep it pure and in its purest sense. He's also disturbed by being aroused by someone he doesn't know well as by behavior that he deems disrespectful to a partner. You see, the world of sex is the entrance into the world of adulthood, and it's for that reason that he resists it. Now, if Holden's judgmental, if he romanticizes certain notions of life, if he's really cynical and depressed, the big question is, can we trust Holden as narrator? In other words, is Holden a reliable narrator? In answering that question, you need to consider whether he honestly deceives, whether he dishonestly deceives, whether there are evaluation issues, and whether there are other factors to consider. So let's look at the first. Does Holden honestly deceive? In other words, he accidentally deceives the reader. This accidental deception is because of his ignorance or naivety. On the other hand, does he dishonestly deceive? In other words, does he deliberately lie in an attempt to deceive? Or because he is deceiving himself, or because of hypocrisy? We also need to consider whether he has evaluation issues. In other words, things like poor judgment or misinterpretations. And finally, are there other factors that we should acknowledge, such as bias, ulterior motives, his youth, and the limited knowledge associated with his youth?